I thought I was the one who never got fooled. That was the thing about me. Ask anyone who knew me back when I was working 31 years with the county assessor's office, the last 12 as department head, and they would have told you the same thing. Harold doesn't miss details. Harold reads the fine print. Harold is the one you call when something doesn't add up. So when my son gave me that tablet for my birthday, I didn't think twice about it. He set it up himself, brought it over on a Saturday morning, sat down at my kitchen table with his coffee, and spent about 40 minutes getting everything connected. He was patient about it, which I noticed because patience had never been his strong suit. Even as a boy, he'd rush through things. Rushed through dinner, rushed through homework, rushed through conversations. But that morning he was deliberate, careful. He showed me how to video call, how to check the weather, how to pull up the news. He even downloaded a crossword app because he knew I liked those. I thanked him. I meant it. He left around noon, and I sat there at that table for a while, just looking at the thing. It had a nice cover on it, navy blue, with a little stand so it propped up on its own. I thought about how far we'd come, the two of us, from the years when things between us weren't easy. His mother passed in 2019, and the first year after that, we didn't talk much. I won't pretend otherwise. Grief does strange things to families. But we'd found our way back to something resembling closeness, and that tablet sitting on my kitchen table felt like evidence of that. I was 68 years old, living alone in the same house I'd bought with my wife 26 years ago in Greensboro, North Carolina. The house needed work I kept putting off. The back gutter had been loose since October. There was a crack in the driveway that got a little longer every winter. But it was my house, paid off, mine, and I knew every corner of it. That should have been enough. For a while it was. His name was Douglas, and he'd been my neighbor for 11 years. We weren't close in the way people mean when they use that word for neighbors. We didn't have each other over for dinner. We didn't know each other's families beyond surface details. But Douglas was the kind of man you trusted instinctively. Quiet, precise, the sort of person who noticed things without making a production of it. He'd worked for 20 years in network infrastructure, something to do with enterprise systems, before he retired early and moved in next door with his wife. We had a routine of sorts. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, we'd both end up at the end of our driveways around the same time, and we'd talk for 10 or 15 minutes before going about our days. Mostly nothing. The weather, the neighborhood association, whatever was in the news. About 3 weeks after my son gave me the tablet, Douglas asked me about it. He'd seen me using it on the porch one afternoon. I told him my son had set it up for my birthday. Douglas nodded slowly, the way he did when he was thinking about something but wasn't ready to say it yet. "What app does he use to call you on it?" he asked. I told him the name. "Standard video call app, nothing unusual." Douglas nodded again. "You mind if I take a look at it sometime?" I didn't think anything of the question. Douglas was always interested in technology, liked seeing what different people were using. I told him, sure, stop by whenever. He came by 2 days later. He sat at my kitchen table, the same spot my son had sat, and he had the tablet for maybe 20 minutes. He didn't say much while he was looking. I made us both coffee and watched the news on low in the other room, not paying much attention. I heard him typing occasionally, heard the little sounds the tablet made when he navigated around. Then he stopped, not gradually. All at once, he just went still. I walked back into the kitchen. He was looking at the screen with an expression I couldn't name immediately. Not alarm, exactly. More like the careful stillness of someone who has just found something they weren't expecting to find and is deciding what to do about it. "Harold," he said, "who else has access to this device?" I told him just me. My son had set it up, but it was mine. Douglas set the tablet down on the table and turned it toward me. He pointed to something in the settings, a section I'd never thought to look at. There were permissions listed there, app permissions, access logs, things I wouldn't have understood without him explaining them. He explained them. There was an application installed on the tablet that I hadn't put there and hadn't known about. It wasn't hidden in any dramatic way. It was just tucked into the app library under a name that sounded like a utility. Something about system maintenance. Douglas pulled it up and showed me what it actually did. It had access to my microphone. It had access to my camera. It had been logging activity. not just mine, but pulling data. He used a word I didn't fully understand, but what he meant was that someone, somewhere, had the ability to see what I was doing on that tablet. Not just what apps I used. More than that. Don't touch anything, Douglas said. Don't change any settings. Don't delete anything. Just leave it exactly as it is. I sat down across from him. I remember the kitchen felt very quiet. The refrigerator was humming. There was a car going by outside. Everything ordinary, the way things are when something extraordinary is happening underneath. Why would he do that? I said. And I wasn't really asking Douglas. I was asking the room. I was asking some version of myself that still wanted there to be a reasonable explanation. Douglas didn't answer right away. He was careful that way. He'd worked long enough in environments where you didn't accuse without evidence. There could be explanations, he said. Parental control software, set up out of habit. Some people do that without thinking about what it means to the other person. He paused. But this is more than that. This is more than keeping an eye on things. He helped me write down everything he'd found. The app name, the version number, the access logs with their dates and timestamps. He showed me how to take screenshots without alerting anyone. We spent about an hour doing that, quietly, carefully, at my kitchen table. When he left, he stopped at the door and looked at me with that same calm expression. You don't have to do anything tonight, he said, but I'd think about who you want to call. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay there in the dark and I did what I imagine most people do in that situation. I went back through everything, looking for signs I'd missed, moments that should have told me something. I replayed that Saturday morning, my son at the kitchen table, his unusual patience, the way he'd taken his time. At the time, I'd read it as affection. Now it felt like something else entirely, and I hated that. I hated the relighting of a memory that had felt good. My son was 41 years old. He worked in commercial real estate, had an office in Charlotte, did well enough by most measures. He'd been married once, divorced a few years back, no children. After his mother died, he'd started coming around more, and I had been grateful for that. I told myself we were finally becoming the kind of father and son I'd always hoped we would be. I thought about my finances. After my wife passed, I'd made some changes, consolidated accounts, put the house and most of my savings into order. I had a financial advisor I'd worked with for years, a woman named Patricia, and she'd helped me set things up in a way that was organized and clear. The house was worth something. The retirement accounts were in decent shape. I wasn't wealthy by any standard, but I was comfortable, and what I had was real and mine and the result of 31 years of careful, unglamorous work. I thought about a conversation I'd had with my son about 4 months earlier. He'd started asking questions about my plans, not in a son worrying about his father way, in a specific, probing way. What was I thinking about doing with the house eventually? Had I thought about whether it made sense to stay in Greensboro long term? There was a continuing care community about 40 minutes away, he'd mentioned. Very nice. People who moved there earlier rather than later tended to be happier with the transition. I had changed the subject. And I didn't think about it again until I was lying in the dark with Douglas's notes on my nightstand. I called my attorney in the morning. Her name was Evelyn, not a close friend, but someone I'd worked with twice before. Once when we bought the house and once when my wife and I updated our wills after she got sick. She was thorough and she was direct, and those were the two qualities I needed. I told her only what was necessary, that I had reason to believe someone had installed monitoring software on my personal device without my knowledge or consent, that I wanted to understand what, if any, legal exposure that created, that I also wanted to review my estate documents. She asked me one question. Did I still trust the people named in those documents? I was quiet for a moment. That's why I'm calling, I said. She told me to come in that week. I went on Thursday. I brought the screenshots Douglas had helped me take, and I brought the handwritten notes. Evelyn reviewed everything without visible reaction, the way attorneys do, but I could see her reading carefully. At one point she stopped and went back to reread something. This is a problem for whoever did this, she said, not for you. She walked me through what I needed to understand. In North Carolina, installing software that intercepts communications or tracks activity on someone's device without their knowledge or consent is not a small matter. It touches on federal statutes in certain configurations. She wasn't making promises about outcomes, but she was very clear that what Douglas had found was not ambiguous. We also reviewed my will and my financial power of attorney. My son was listed as primary beneficiary for most things, and as my agent under the financial power of attorney, which meant that if I were ever incapacitated, he would have authority over my accounts and my property. I had signed those documents 8 years earlier when things were different, when my wife was still alive and we had made those decisions together, when I believed without question that my son was exactly who I thought he was. I asked Evelyn what it would take to change them. She told me it wasn't complicated. It took about 2 weeks for the paperwork to be prepared properly, and I came back in to sign. I updated the will. I updated the power of attorney, naming Douglas's wife, who happened to be a licensed social worker with no financial interest in my affairs, as my agent instead, with Evelyn herself as the secondary. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was honest, and it was mine. I did all of this quietly. I did not confront my son. I did not change my behavior around him. I answered his calls the same way I always had. I asked about his work. I mentioned the crossword app he put on the tablet, said I'd been enjoying it. He sounded pleased. I kept the tablet on my kitchen table, exactly where it had always been, and I used it exactly the way I had before. I just stopped saying anything near it that I didn't want someone else to hear. There is something clarifying about deciding not to react. I had spent most of my life believing that the right response to a problem was to address it directly, to have the conversation, to work things out. My wife had been better at that than me, frankly. She had a gift for talking through hard things without making them harder. After she was gone, I tried to carry that forward with my son, tried to keep the lines open even when it was uncomfortable. I thought that was what love required. I thought it was what she would have wanted. But sitting with what I now knew, I understood something different. There was no conversation that was going to explain away what Douglas had found. There was no version of my son that would make that make sense in a way I could accept. And whatever he had been planning, whether it was to move me out of my home, whether it was to position himself to control my finances, whether it was something I still hadn't thought of, he had already made a choice about who we were to each other. He'd made that choice on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and a tablet in a navy blue case, and all the patience he'd never had as a boy. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I kept waiting for the anger to arrive, and it didn't, not in the way I expected. What I felt instead was a kind of grief, steady and keen, like the beginning of a long settling. The same feeling I'd had in the weeks after my wife passed, that low-grade reckoning with the shape of things as they actually were. The question I kept coming back to was simpler than I would have expected. Not why he did it, not when it started. Just this: how long had I been living in a house that someone else had already decided what to do with? About 6 weeks after Douglas first sat down at my kitchen table, I had a visit from a detective with the Greensboro Police Department. I had called them myself. I had asked Evelyn whether I should, and she'd said it was my choice, but that if I wanted what had happened documented officially, this was the time. The longer I waited, the murkier the timeline became. I said I wanted it documented. The detective was a woman, younger than I expected, with a straightforward manner that I appreciated. She sat at the same kitchen table that had become, over the past 6 weeks, the place where everything important in this story had happened. I gave her the screenshots. I gave her the notes. I gave her Douglas's contact information and told her he had found it first and would be able to explain the technical side better than I could. She asked me about my son. I answered her questions directly and without drama. I told her what he had installed, what Douglas had found, what the access logs showed. I told her about the conversation 4 months earlier, about the continuing care community. She wrote things down. When she was finished, she closed her notebook and looked at me with a measured expression. "Mr. Writer, Harold," she said, "I want you to know that what you did, documenting everything, not changing anything, not tipping anyone off, that was exactly right. A lot of people would have confronted the person immediately, and that would have made this harder." I told her I'd had a good neighbor. She nodded. "You also had good instincts." I wasn't sure that was true. My instincts had told me that birthday morning that things were good, that we'd arrived somewhere, that the careful, patient man setting up a tablet at my kitchen table was evidence of healing. But maybe instincts aren't about never being wrong. Maybe they're about what you do once you finally see clearly. I haven't spoken to my son since. That sentence sits differently than I expected. I thought it would feel like a wound, and in some ways it does. He is still my son. Whatever he became or was planning to become, he is still the boy who used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from his grandmother's house, who cried for an hour when our first dog died, who sat next to his mother's hospital bed in the last days and held her hand. I don't get to throw that away. I don't think I'd want to even if I could. But I also can't pretend that love is a reason to put yourself back in the path of something that's already moved against you. My attorney handled the communications that needed to happen. My son was informed through her of certain changes. I don't know what he said in response because I asked her not to tell me unless it was legally necessary. I kept the house. I kept my accounts. I kept my life, which is small and ordinary and entirely mine. The loose gutter that I finally had someone come out and fix, the crack in the driveway, the crossword puzzles I still do in the evenings. Though on a different device now, one Douglas helped me set up himself. I think about something Douglas said to me not long after everything settled, one of our Tuesday mornings at the end of the driveways. He said, "You know what the strange thing is about trust? It doesn't go away when someone breaks it. It just moves. You find out where it actually lives." I thought about that for a long time afterward. He was right. Trust doesn't disappear. It relocates. It stops living in the places where it was misplaced and starts building in the places that earned it. Slowly, without announcement, the way most things that last are built. I am 68 years old. I live alone in a house I've paid for, in a neighborhood where I know my neighbor's footsteps on the driveway before I see him. I have an attorney who answers her phone. I have a crossword puzzle waiting for me on a screen that is only mine. And I have learned finally and completely that the most dangerous gift is the one that asks nothing of you on the surface, the one that comes wrapped in patience and love and a navy blue case, because that is the gift that has already decided what it wants in return. Pay attention to the quiet ones, not the people who demand things openly, not the ones who argue or threaten or make themselves known. Pay attention to the ones who are suddenly unusually patient, who give without explaining why, who set things up carefully and then wait. You build something in this life, something real, something yours. Don't let it be managed while you're still in it. That's the thing I wish someone had told me sooner. It doesn't take malice to lose what you have. It only takes not noticing for just long enough that someone else had already started counting it. I used to think the worst kind of betrayal was the loud kind, the kind that announces itself, the argument that goes too far, the door that slams, the words that can't be taken back. I thought if something was going to hurt you, you'd see it coming. What happened with my son taught me that the quietest things cause the deepest damage. He didn't argue with me. He didn't threaten me. He sat at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and all the patience in the world, and he built something I couldn't see. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the anger of it. I told you, the anger never really came, but the precision, the planning. You don't do something like that by accident. You do it because you've already decided somewhere along the way that the other person is a resource to be managed rather than a human being to be loved. And here is what I've learned about consequences. They are rarely dramatic. They don't arrive with noise. They accumulate quietly in the same way the act itself was quiet. My son made choices. Those choices shaped who he became. Not in some abstract sense, but in the most practical one. The person you are in the small moments, in the moments no one is watching, in the moments you believe you have control, that is who you actually are. And eventually that person meets the world. Douglas did something for me that I think about often. He didn't react with outrage. He didn't tell me what to do. He simply looked carefully, thought clearly, and told me the truth without dressing it up. That kind of clarity, the ability to see a situation for exactly what it is, without fear and without wishful thinking, that is something you have to earn. It doesn't come from intelligence alone. It comes from years of choosing honesty over comfort, even when comfort would have been easier. Douglas had those years in him. You could see it. I had to decide in those weeks what kind of man I was going to be in response to what had been done to me. And I realized the hardest part wasn't the legal paperwork, wasn't changing the documents, wasn't any of the practical steps. The hardest part was not becoming someone smaller, not letting what happened turn me into a person who trusts no one, who closes off, who mistakes caution for wisdom. It took something to stay open to Douglas, to Evelyn, to the idea that the world still contained people worth trusting. That kind of endurance, choosing not to harden when hardening would have been so much easier. That is its own form of strength. I am still the man who lives in a house he paid for, in a neighborhood he knows. I am still the man who does his crossword in the evening. I am still a father, even when that word carries weight I didn't ask for. But I'm also the man who learned, late and permanently, that love is not a reason to stop paying attention. That the people who mean you harm rarely look like villains. And that the life you built, carefully, unglamorously, year by year, is worth exactly as much effort to protect as it took to create. Don't wait for something loud to wake you up. The quiet is where it happens.